So the video today has left me slightly nonplussed. Going into this discovery session, I will enlighten you with facts you may have possibly understood in a very passive, Enid sense, in that you don't quite comprehend the gravity of the current failures of the Canadian government and successive failures over, say, 20 years. I think Canada is especially bad, and I'll highlight exactly why, in that they've gone through what looks like an accelerated decline in the way that the public policy has been the most aggressively terrible for residents and citizens compared to the rest of the West. So in isolation, Canada looks terrible, and then even comparatively it looks like garbage. So slightly bewildered by how bad it is, and you'll see. I wanted to preface the video by giving you this amazing little snippet from the Canadian budget for this year, as outlined by Justin Trudeau's government. They go on to say, and this is specifically about immigration, because I think Canada's biggest, most glaring problems all stem from the one source, and it is a self-inflicted wound. So it's a interesting discussion around how the government portrays this problem and what they do to, you would say, contextualize, but also frame it in a way that they can spin it how they want and how they want you to think about it. So you have to remember, in a government, when they propose a budget, they're utilizing a vast range of civil servants, from policymakers to economists to party politic advisors, etc. So there's a range, and very many also consultants who work on these huge budgets and have input to the nth degree on all the iterations. So you should remember that this was the agreed upon wording and choice of words by very many people who have edited this document. So we start by saying that managing demand, a sustainable immigration strategy. Sustainable. Immigrants built Canada, and when new Canadians arrive today, our society is enriched. Canada, like other advanced economies, needs immigrants today more than ever. Given our aging population, immigrants are essential to maintaining a young and capable workforce, to ensuring we can find the doctors, construction workers, nurses, and early childhood educators that we need. Isn't that lovely? So the Canadian government, as we can see, is all on board for more immigration, whilst managing the demand and saying, it's not necessarily going poorly, you just think it's going poorly. We're actually quite happy with how it's going. So when we look at the statistics here, because obviously that's such unbelievable farce that as I said, I was agog to start the video, but I was nonplussed to have to actually compile all this data to counteract the absolute propaganda tier sensationalism done there of some editorial Canadian public servants have whipped up for you. So I thought it was best maybe if we start with the claims around foreign-born population, and it is technically true, I would say, and this probably isn't surprising. Canada is a colonial country, thus by definition was founded by colonialists, and they can, I guess, be called immigrants. It's a very loose usage of the term, and I think the generic use of immigrants is always something that belies a much more complex and you would have to say intricate mechanism for increasing population. Over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, humans have migrated, but immigrants are not one banner, one uniform, one unity here. Immigrants are very specific, and when and where they come from determines a lot about what happens when they get somewhere. If you consider the Vikings were obviously already in Canada before anyone else, so technically that's probably native population is Icelandic or Norwegians. But here we can look at what is the claim around and the percentage of foreign-born population in Canada, which is all well and good, right? We can see here that you have at the moment something around 6.75 million foreign-born Canadians, and the total percentage of foreign-born peoples is 6%. And you might say, oh, 6%, that's not much. You have to remember Canada is now a country with nearly 40 million people. So you have 2.5 million people who are basically not Canadian, which is the size, I would say, of a decent city, completely foreign-born, not including, obviously, second generation, etc. And I think the important part here is to then say, fundamentally, what is the differences, given that if Canada is having a quite steady level of immigrants, where do they come from? Now, this is the fun one, because up until about 1970 here, you can see that the population of foreign-born in Canada from selected regions, and we would call these underdeveloped regions, if I'm being very generous, or the third world, in which is to say that it hovered in a range that was much lower than what it looks like today. Because, and this is obviously seen, borne out here on this chart, of an ever-increasing exponential nature. Almost none of these graph points are trending flat or down. They're all going uppity, uppity, up. But you then have the composition here of immigrants by place of birth. And now, when we do look back in history, we can see that most of all Canadian immigrants, up until about the 1970s here, have been from British Isles, Scandinavia, Western Europe, slightly some from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, and then mostly the United States. So the nature of immigrants built Canada is a very technically true term. It's not that you would find your ancestors, though, looking like the current immigrants. So the current crop of immigrants, which is these ever-increasing green, yellow, red, orange bars, are the different kind of immigrants. They're not necessarily able to support themselves. They're not necessarily able to work. So there's a high level of underemployment if they are employed at all, but there's also even larger levels of non-inclusion into the workforce. So as I've stated in previous videos on this, immigrants, and particularly refugees and asylum seekers, which I don't know why Canada would have any, but there's no wars around Canada. The number and nature of their occupation of the country does not necessarily include their participation in a workforce. So you could have 1 million residents or asylum seekers, refugees, who don't work, but that's 1 million people not working, thus requiring government stipend and other associated deleterious effects thereof. But we can actually look at employment incidents among stayers, they call them, 5 years after landing, by immigration class and size. So the Statistical Bank of Canada provides basically all of this data, and it's quite comprehensive. They don't currently break it down in ways that allow me to show you the even starker reality, but this is the best I could triangulate for you, in which we can see that the levels of government-assisted refugees, privately sponsored refugees, family class and economic class, all of them are incapable of participating in employment. So the idea that you would move to a country where you can't work and support yourself would have been ludicrous 100 years ago. No country would have accepted someone who was literally going to sponge off and drain an economy. That would be suicidal. But once the West developed social security and its varied and myriad arms of benefiting the poor and the underserved, you then have a siren singing her song to lure in all of these, we'll say, disenfranchised and underserved economic portions of the globe, and such that you do have people who are incapable of working even in a first world economy, even as gig economy workers, which is riding a bike with food strapped to your back, as ignoble and as that might be for someone who claims to have a Bachelor of Computer Science from some Indian university no one's ever heard of. This is still the level of unemployment available to the populations in these areas, and you can see particularly bad of these government-assisted refugees. They're by far the worst performing level of employment, and that just highlights exactly how poor Canada is about integrating refugees. It's very clearly that there's a mismatch between both the skills and the culture of the countries that they're requisitioning refugees from. So there needs to be a reflection, I would think, that if this participation rate is so poor, then you may have to rethink what the idea was in terms of sending refugees home, because traditionally a refugee would always intend to go home. Home is not where you flee from, it's where you return to. And that would, in, I guess, 20th century logic, been what the refugee programs were established for. Is that, okay, whilst there is tumult in your home country, you come here for safety, and then once that stops, as almost every war has from Iraq to Afghanistan, you go home. Evidently that is no longer the case. And you can see here that the median income from immigration cohorts, and immigration here once again is a very broadband term, so I couldn't specifically draw out skilled immigration from Western countries like you see here, so these blue bars. I couldn't draw these out in this data, but I guarantee you if you did, you would find a huge drop in all of these. But even still, immigrants from cohorts to Canada are incapable of even coming up to the threshold here of the Canadian median income. This is how poorly they're performing as a class, and it's seen across the West, so it's not like it's an anomaly here in Canada. It's mostly around why Canada has an insatiable desire for immigrants in the third world, when they can clearly see that they're performing poorly across all economic metrics, let alone social metrics. And the idea that this is a problem that the government is solving can be seen here from the lack of deportation. So if you have switched your visa during your stay because Canada was allowing you to apply for visas while you were in the country, and the processing times and etc. I'll go into, but you can see that the deportations are fairly low, mostly insignificant. It's a infinitesimal amount of deportations compared to total rejections of asylum, refugee and other visas. So embarrassing numbers here from the successive Canadian governments. And I won't highlight the Liberals or the Conservatives as the largest problems here. I think it's very much a Canadian elite problem, whereby both, you could call it a hybridization of a malicious and ignorance. So they're malicious in the way that they want to punish those they deem, and that's themselves usually, as evil white men or women, and being ignorant around the effects of what it means to actually intake so many third worlders. And I can highlight some of the problems here. So the idea that you can afford a house in Canada is obviously ludicrous. The range of house prices, what would have been around about the time of the global financial crisis, hovering at, you see, like the $320,000, $330,000 mark. So if you're a newly graduated student into a graduate job, like a normal job in any medium-sized company, taking home $45,000, $50,000, you would, after say 4 or 5 years, have the hope that you would be able to buy a house and start a family and progress through. And this is increasing maybe a birth rate, which would, as they said before, address the need of a aging population, which is a bit of a myth on its own. But we'll continue to see here in Canada such an outrageous and vertiginous increase in the price of Canadian single-family homes. Now, this is not even adjusted for cities, because by and large, when we look at cities, we have, there's a study I can show, but there's about 90% of all immigrants to Canada go to a medium-sized or bigger city. So if you adjusted out the rural and semi-rural from these graphs, you would find an even more aggressive, particularly if you also included per square meter or per square foot price, when you consider things like attached or apartment condominium homes. But in any case, you're looking at 800,000 here, which would require you to normally, under a generous mortgage giver, have a salary of around $175,000, maybe $200,000 Canadian, which is an enormous amount of money for almost everyone who's not working in very serious industries at higher levels. So the idea that you and a combined spouse would ever be able to afford just the single family benchmark home is fairly poor at the moment, and I think it's going to get worse, with Canada throwing what is more or less symbolic money and gestures at home building, whilst still simultaneously talking about such high immigration levels that the next 3 million homes they're going to build will be a deficit of potentially 3 or 4 more. So they'll be even worse off, and prices will reflect that. You can also include their terrible policy around foreign home ownership. Now, looking at the 2020 numbers, there's no more recent, it's estimated at 2 to 6%. If you include how holdcos, holding companies work, and offshore accounts, etc., with various bypass-through methods, particularly in Canada, when you send your student, and this is the methods of the Chinese, is when they send their kids to school, then they will use them as an offshoring of their money to then buy houses, and then using that money obviously means that it's not typically owned by an international if that student then becomes a citizen and or has a permanent residency, etc. So this number is probably more like 10%, and as you can see here in the biggest cities, which is where the concentration of foreign capital is, it's even up to 12, and you could, as I said, using the adjusted method, probably say it's more like 15 to 20%, which is an outrageous farce. If you're going to have a housing market, you need to have regulations involved with people actually living there, and not just parking cash, hoping for investment returns and or laundering the money. That's a very simple policy, and all of these things are very fixable. Once again, with politics, you have to understand that if something wants to get done, look at lockdowns during COVID, it gets done. Everyone can uniformly agree on something very quickly and address an issue. It's very simple. There is no excuse. They played their hand very aggressively during COVID, but there's other symptoms of this, and Keir Starmer in the UK obviously being one of the large proponents of fast-track sentencing, which just shows that there's always government mandate and will and money for something if there's a pressing need for the sovereign in this case. Justin Trudeau being the sovereign, well, the stand-in marionette for the sovereign in Canada. You can also see that the median wage here of immigrants is, and this is maybe addressing more points around immigration, not particularly housing market, even though that is a massive outcome from having high levels of immigration. You have the inability, even with a work and study permit, so someone who's being deemed by the administration qualified both to study and then work, as not even reaching 50,000 as a median wage. Now, if you're talking house prices, you can see that at 45,000, even if you're very generous and you say both you and your partner were earning the combined median wage of a foreigner, then you were taking home 90k, which allows you to probably borrow at most $450,000. So in that, and using that as your benchmark, how on earth is a foreigner who's qualified by the administration ever going to buy a house? They won't. They'll have to rent, pushing rent prices up, which is a burden for almost everyone who's underserved in a community already. You're talking about pensioners, you're talking about students, young people, people who are building towards buying a home. And this is how Western policy has fundamentally shifted. It's gone away from a home being the nest where you raise your chicks into, oh, look how much my home is worth, it's an investment, I can sell it and move to Corfu. So the idea that boomers have basically run up the scoreboard on their home prices as a use for their proxy inability to save for their retirement, which is punishing everyone. Obviously the foreseeable population increases would have been logical had you understood your own policies when it comes to immigration. If I know that I'll be net increasing my population by 200,000 people every year for the next 5 years in the budget, as the Canadian budget very clearly states, you can see here the 2023-2025 immigration levels. Canada aims to welcome more than 410 to 505,000 new permanent residents from 2023, and then another 500,000 in 2024 and another 500,000 in 2025. So in 3 years, 1.5 million people will arrive. If an average house holds 2 people, you need 750,000 more homes, on top of the current housing shortage, on top of what this will be is a permanent level versus, as you see here, permanent versus temporary. And now the Canadian government has assured us that the reduction in temporary Canadian immigrants is something pending and or enforced, but it obviously will be a farce, and that everyone who knows how to game the system will do so as they have been doing. Canadian impotence when it comes to political maneuvers in the immigration space is famous worldwide. I mean, there's a reason that all these Indian companies are running degree mills for these, you might call them undereducated Indians, but they're hopeful masses. you can see here that and this is also from one of their budget publications, where they have said, and this is the irony of the Canadian government, and then you can get a sense of this ivory tower that they are living in, and it's why we get these penthouse Bolsheviks, this idea of a champagne socialist, sitting there writing this nonsense, but fully believing it to be true. And so the disconnect, there isn't actually a cognitive dissonance here at all. This is just how they think. It's not malicious, it's not evil. They legitimately think, as a Marvel movie exists, they're good guys fighting bad guys, and or the good guys welcoming with open arms all the disenfranchised under economic the rant being much more focused on the facts here, which is to say, we will have I'll quote it: there are more racialized persons working and actively looking for work in Canada than non-racialized persons, and yet their unemployment rates are higher. Racialized women experience the poorest labor market outcomes, suggesting a double disadvantage. So the vernacular used is obviously something unforgivable when it comes to writing a very clear and defined sentence, and that no one has grown up using language like this. This is clearly weaponized in a way that's meant to be unoffensive, but to the degree that it's making not very much sense to anyone who actually reads words. Racialized here, from what I could gather in the document itself, was to say brown people or like Asians or something, whereas white people have better outcomes. And what they're imputing here with this conclusion is that Canadians are racist and sexist, whereas what I can understand is that you've got a lot of third world immigrants who are woeful, both working and understanding a system that they're trying to integrate, well, not even attempting to integrate into, but exist in. So why would you want to import more of these people who have to be helped more if you're having issues with housing and you're having budgetary issues, which I can get into? But I would just first like to show you the data that they have collected on the immigrants categories of how they've been able to earn money as according to their status of immigration, and the chart here being quite large just because of the classifications that you have. But you can see here refugees earning even in 2021 $30,000. This is barely minimum wage, and I would say of that you have probably mostly government mandated and or civil jobs and programs. So they're being given employment by the state, or at least being supported by the state to be employed, which is just a drain on resources. But it also removes the ability for local and Canadian-born Canadians to actually work themselves in lower skilled jobs, which it gives them obviously better CV, allows them to have opportunities going forward to build their skill sets and progress in life. This is what everyone has had the opportunity to do in Canada up until the immigration crises started in the 80s and 90s. So the complete removal and disenfranchisement of a certain sector of your own local populace to help people who don't even need the help. They're just here to earn an easier living. This is the suicidal pact that Canada has signed up for, and I'm seriously bewildered and bamboozled as to how this has happened. Like, I'm not Canadian, obviously you can tell, but the idea that Canadians would have been so pleasant and and open arms and I guess docile in their ineptitude around planning for successive generations to be propitious and actually be more well off in that sense it's very alarming. I think it's hard to quite overstate how terrifying it would be for me to be a Canadian if I was particularly even younger than I am. The last nail for this coffin, which maybe it's gratuitous at this point, but is to let me just zoom in a little bit for you. It's to highlight that a budget is being built around what is a huge detrimental immigration problem. So Canadians obviously spent a lot during corona lockdowns. I say Canadians, the government borrowed and or begged for this amount of money, and they've started to pay it back. Now they paid down to 35. the new government has suggested a budget with an increased deficit. So what they're implying by this is that they will have to borrow $4.7 billion to balance their budget. So they don't have the money they want to spend, but that's okay, they're borrowing it on your behalf. They're saying, hey Canadians, you voted for us, let us make these fiscal decisions in the most intelligent, circumspect way we can, and this is what you get. You get a huge increase in the deficit here, more than 10%. And when we look at all the fun things that you'll be paying for, Canadians, get excited because you've included $273 million for Canada's Action Plan on Combating Hate, which when you try and discover what this is, it is complete and utter nonsense. And I guarantee you not a cent of that is in any way utilized in any way that addresses combating hate. And you also have to pay $1.5 billion for Africa and the Middle East. So congratulations on your reparations that I have no idea why you're paying. On top of said luxurious and exorbitant payments, you'll also be doing these, and I want to read them out to you because of how unreal they are. I'm literally gobsmacked. So some key ongoing actions, these were just the snippets, by the way. There's a whole budget you can read through with, and it's drowning in this sort of nonsense. The continued prioritization of gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls through Canada's feminist international assistance policy, including investments of $1.4 billion per year in global health. Not for Canadian global health, sorry. Not to make Canadians healthier, but we're making the world healthier, because that's Canada's prerogative and duty, obviously. Half of which is dedicated to sexual and reproductive health and rights every year until 2030. So you'll be spending $8.4 billion on sexual reproductive medicine or something for people you don't know, which is obviously a very good use of money, because as First Worlds we must be charitable because of our, as you see, our extreme beneficial budgeting that we're able to do here and borrow money, not even cheap at the moment, but in general, our ability to borrow money. On top of this, there's $700 million special drawing rights, around $1.3 billion, to the International Monetary Fund's Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, because you don't have any poor people in Canada, so you have to help the other ones across the world. And something about claiming the effect is down to the IMF spending that money wisely, which we all know is definitely what the international organizations love to do. They don't squander that cash at all. More than $400 million in security, humanitarian, and development assistance in response to the crisis in Haiti since 2022. Well done. You've continued to support what would be war criminals in ways that are probably best to not mention. Then we have $350 million to support developing countries, home to the vast majority of the world's biodiversity, and conservation efforts and implementing the CUNMIG Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Canada, obviously notoriously being home to almost no forests and or biodiversity, and would never use that money wisely on itself. And then lastly, $16 million towards the startup, not to mention that Canadian industry is mostly centered around oil and gas, forestry, and these very negatively affecting environmental industries, right? Like you would think, but anyway. The $16 million towards the startup cost and a global fund to address loss, and $16 million, which is a paltry amount for any startup global fund, that barely pays for like the coffee and tea for the summits you'll be hosting. Part of Canada's $5.3 billion international climate finance commitment. So lucky you, Canada, the lowest polluting per person acreage outside of the cities, is going to contribute $5 billion, which is more than the deficit would have been, to international climate finance. So that's very charitable and generous of you Canadians. We definitely appreciate that, and all the good work you've been doing has been very influential and productive in its deployment. There's just a few more here, and then I'll wrap it up. In February 2019, Canada announced its new LGBTQI+ international assistance program to advance human rights. Every year, the government is providing $30 million in dedicated funding. So for 5 years. So it's $150 million. And $10 million every year thereafter, in perpetuity, one would assume, What this addresses in developing countries, God only knows, because I think if you're going to be stoned to death or thrown off a building in a country, money is probably not going to save you. So it's maybe around propaganda. So you may be supporting homosexual and transgender propaganda to some degree. But we'll leave that as an under researched point there. And then to finally wrap up here, is to say that there is more anti-racism strategy. So you're also having a action plan on combating hate, and you're having an anti-racism. Anyway, I wanted to wrap up with what the core thesis was on this, which is a ratiocination of why Canada is trending fastest towards this hellscape of Brazilification, or South Africa in 20, 30 years, is because you have the idea that the government feels comfortable spending $270 million every year on immigration and asylum refugee cases, which is a created problem. You've literally invited the world to apply, and now you have to spend money to address that application, rather than say like Singapore, where you don't have any application process other than if you force it, they will respond to you, but they won't provide you with anything ever. So if you are going to move there, you have to move there with economic intent to provide for yourself, and then obviously contribute to the broader society. So this is the Canadian, as I say, suicide pact. The euthanasia is not just a microcosm, it's a macrocosm for the Canadian species almost. There's this pathological need, it seems, that the Canadian has to self-sabotage, because they've been blessed so long that what was once the crown jewel of the Commonwealth, almost, in the way that it was able to prosper, is now an utter failure, and in 20 years will be unrecognizable.